A United States Army Provost Marshal Sergeant walked into a bar in Saigon in the late summer of 1969 and spotted a problem. The problem was sitting at a corner table nursing a beer, wearing a non-regulation beret, a uniform that mixed Australian jungle greens with American Special Forces equipment, and a chest that carried more decorations than most American colonels would see in 2 careers. The sergeant had one job: enforce Military Assistance Command Vietnam's dress code across all Allied personnel in the capital. And the man at that corner table was in clear violation of it. He approached. He demanded identification. He pointed at the beret and announced that it did not conform to authorized Allied dress regulations and would have to be removed. The Australian looked at him for a long moment. Then he told the sergeant, with a calm that was somehow more terrifying than any raised voice could have been, exactly what he thought of that demand. Within 4 hours, the matter had escalated through 3 separate command layers, reached an Australian colonel's desk, and produced a written response to MACV that essentially said, "Try that again, and we will involve Canberra." The beret stayed on. The sergeant was reassigned. This was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom, one flashpoint in a years-long collision between 2 fundamentally different ideas about what military authority meant, what military excellence looked like, and which flag mattered most when the shooting started. And to understand why a beret could generate that kind of heat, you have to understand the men who wore one, why they wore it, and what they had done to earn the right to push back when someone told them to take it off. When the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam arrived in Saigon in August 1962, they changed into their uniforms on the aeroplane. Not on the tarmac, not in a terminal, on the aircraft, because Australian diplomatic sensitivity at that moment meant they were not supposed to arrive in uniform at all. 29 officers and senior NCOs, handpicked from across the Australian Army, most of them veterans of Korea and the Malayan emergency, squeezed one by one into the lavatories of a commercial flight from Singapore and emerged transformed. By the time the wheels touched down at Tan Son Nhut Airport, they were soldiers again. The first Australian troops formally committed to Vietnam. They called themselves the Team. The full designation was the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, AATV, but nobody in the field used the full name. They were simply the Team, and the designation carried a weight that the official nomenclature never quite captured, because from the moment they arrived, it was clear that these were not ordinary advisors. The average age was 35. Every single member was a career soldier of long standing. Many had been fighting in one jungle or another for the better part of a decade. Their first commanding officer, Colonel Francis Sarong, was a former commandant of the Jungle Training Center at Canungra, Queensland, a man so deeply respected for his counterinsurgency expertise that General Paul Harkins, commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, used him as a personal special advisor on revolutionary warfare. The Americans consulted Sarong at the highest levels, and then, frequently, they ignored what he told them. The team began with around 30 men. It grew. By November 1970, it had reached a peak strength of 217, but it never became a conventional unit in any meaningful sense. Its members operated individually, in pairs, or in groups of no more than 10. They were scattered across all 4 core tactical zones of South Vietnam, from the demilitarized zone in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south. They advised, trained, and often led South Vietnamese regular forces, regional forces, special forces, civilian irregular defense group companies, mobile strike force companies full of Montagnard fighters, and units so irregular that their exact composition changed from week to week. The entire unit met as a single formation exactly once during the war. On September 30th, 1970, at Vung Tau, they paraded to receive the United States Army Meritorious Unit Commendation from General Crichton Abrams, commander of MA-SAV. Abrams presented the award himself. His remarks were brief and uncharacteristically understated for a man known for directness. He noted that the AATV had accomplished things with handfuls of men that American units of 10 times the size had failed to accomplish. He did not elaborate on why. He did not need to, because by 1970 the record spoke for itself. The AATV was the most decorated Australian unit of the Vietnam War. In 10 years of continuous deployment, its 217 members at peak strength, a force smaller than a single American rifle company, received over 100 individual decorations for gallantry. Those decorations included 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 6 Military Crosses, 20 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 15 Military Medals, and 49 Mentions in Dispatches, and 4 Victoria Crosses. 4 Victoria Crosses from a unit that never exceeded 217 personnel. The VC is the highest honor in the British and Commonwealth military system, awarded for conspicuous gallantry in the face of the enemy under circumstances of the greatest danger. The British Army awarded 4 Victoria Crosses during the entire Malayan emergency across a force of tens of thousands over 12 years. The AATV awarded 4 in a force of fewer than 300 men over 10 years in Vietnam. The ratio is staggering. It is one of the most concentrated records of individual valor in modern military history, and it belongs to a unit whose existence most people, including most Americans who served alongside them, could not have accurately described. Kevin Dasher Wheatley was the first. He died on the 13th of November 1965 in Tra Bong Valley, refusing to leave his mortally wounded partner, Warrant Officer Ron Swanton, on the field. Under heavy machine gun and automatic fire, he half-dragged, half-carried Swanton across 200 meters of open rice paddies. When he knew evacuation was impossible and the enemy was closing in, he pulled the pins from 2 grenades and stood his ground. He was 28 years old. His Victoria Cross was posthumous. Peter Badco was the second. An artillery officer turned infantry advisor, he was killed on April 7, 1967, 3 times in the space of 6 weeks, having led South Vietnamese soldiers into situations where no officer with any concern for his personal safety would have gone. He was 33. His Victoria Cross was also posthumous. His widow donated his medals to the Australian War Memorial, where they remain. The citation described him as a man who fought not from aggression, but from an almost serene conviction that he was supposed to be wherever the danger was greatest. Ray Simpson was the third. He survived. Keith Payne was the fourth. He also survived. Both Simpson and Payne were warrant officers Class II. Both were career soldiers of long service and deep experience. Both were commanding Montagnard companies under the auspices of U.S. Army Special Forces when they performed the actions that earned their decorations. Both were in their 40s, old by the standards of the men around them, unmovable by the standards of any military culture that measured worth in years of practice rather than years of age. And both wore their identity as Australians, the way a man wears a second skin, not with aggression, not with apology, but with a quiet completeness that made the question of whether they deferred to American authority feel almost philosophically absurd. The AATV's relationship with its own uniform was, by any conventional military standard, chaotic, and the chaos was the product of necessity, doctrine, and a deliberate refusal to let paperwork get in the way of getting the job done. The original intention, established when the team was raised in 1962, was that AATV personnel would wear Australian uniforms. This was a diplomatic decision as much as a military one. It was important that Australia's contribution to Vietnam be clearly identifiable, that there be no confusion between Australian advisors and their American counterparts, and that the distinctiveness of Australian involvement be preserved as a matter of national record. The field immediately complicated this plan. AATV members were dispersed across the entire country in ones and twos, attached to units whose logistic systems were American. Australian resupply of specialist equipment was infrequent. When your jungle greens wore out in the field, and the next resupply was 3 months away, you wore what the unit around you was wearing: American fatigues, South Vietnamese uniforms, tiger stripe camouflage acquired locally. Whatever was available, whatever worked, whatever did not get you shot by your own people. The result was that by the mid-1960s, AATV personnel in the field looked like a deliberate exercise in military eclecticism. Australian jungle greens worn with American equipment, American fatigues worn with Australian badges, tiger stripe patterns that matched nothing in any official catalog, and, increasingly, the Green Beret of the United States Army Special Forces, because many AATV men were operating directly embedded with Special Forces A-teams and B-teams, and wearing the distinctive headgear of the unit you were fighting alongside was not vanity. It was operational logic. It was identity. In 1967, the commander of Australian Forces Vietnam officially authorized an AATV shoulder patch, a green shield bearing a crossbow, a boomerang, and the word persevere to be worn on the right shoulder of field uniform. An initial batch was produced using unit funds in Japan. The authorization acknowledged what the field had already established, that AATV soldiers would mark themselves as Australians, would carry Australian identity through whatever mixture of international kit they happened to be wearing, and would not be easily absorbed into the visual uniformity that MACV preferred. The MACV preferred visual uniformity for the same reason any large bureaucracy prefers it. Uniformity is legible. Legibility is controllable. Control is the baseline assumption of an organization with 500,000 personnel trying to present a coherent face to the world, to the press, to the Congress, and to the enemy. The AATV, whose total strength never reached 250,000 men, had different priorities. Then, around 1970, the AATV adopted a rifle green beret of their own, distinct from the American Special Forces green, distinct from anything worn by other Australian units in Vietnam, carrying a metallic AATV badge. It was authorized for wear in-country, a theater-specific item that said, precisely and unmistakably, "This man is AATV, this man is Australian, and this man will not be confused for anyone else." It was this beret, or its predecessors in the complicated uniform evolution of the 1960s, that generated confrontations with American military police and Provost personnel, who saw non-regulation headgear and responded with the institutional reflex that non-regulation headgear requires correction. The confrontations were not rare. The documentation of them is sparse because the AATV operated in environments where paperwork about Beret disputes was not a high priority. But the cultural reality they reflected was consistent and documented. American MPS and Provost personnel, operating under MACV dress regulations that applied to Allied forces within their jurisdiction, periodically attempted to enforce those regulations on Australian soldiers who did not consider themselves subject to American authority in matters of uniform, and who possessed the rank, experience, and institutional backing to say so with force. To understand the weight of these confrontations, it helps to understand the specific gravity of the men involved. Ray Simpson had been a soldier since March 1944, when he enlisted 4 weeks after his 18th birthday. He had fought on Morotai, Borneo, and New Guinea in the Pacific War. He had served in Korea with the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. He had done 2 years in Malaya during the emergency. He had been one of the original 29 members of the AATV who changed into their uniforms on that commercial flight from Singapore in 1962. He was serving his 3rd tour of Vietnam in 1969. Having discharged himself from the Australian Army in 1966, made his way to Saigon independently, and re-enlisted there because he was not finished. When, on May 6th of that year, his Montagnard Company of the 232nd Mobile Strike Force came under heavy contact in Kon Tum Province near the Laotian border. What happened over 6 and 11 May 1969 is recorded in the Victoria Cross citation published in the Commonwealth of Australia Gazette on 28 August 1969. On 6 May, with one of his platoons heavily engaged by the enemy, Simpson led the remainder of his company through dense jungle to assist. A fellow Australian warrant officer, commanding one of the platoons, Mike Gill, was seriously wounded, and the assault began to falter. Simpson, under heavy machine gun fire, crossed open ground, picked up Gill, and carried him to safety. He returned. He crawled forward to within 10 meters of the enemy position and hurled grenades into it. He then ordered his company to withdraw and, with 5 indigenous soldiers, covered the withdrawal. He was the last man out. On May 11th, in a second action, his battalion again came under heavy fire with many casualties. Simpson placed himself alone, still under enemy fire, between the enemy and the wounded men, holding the position so others could be evacuated. A tree beside him was ripped apart by enemy fire. He did not move until the last wounded man was clear. His citation concluded, "Warrant Officer Simpson's repeated acts of personal bravery in this operation were an inspiration to all Vietnamese, United States, and Australian soldiers who served with him. His conspicuous gallantry was in the highest tradition of the Australian Army." The United States added its own assessment, the Silver Star and the Bronze Star for valor. Keith Payne's actions were 2 weeks later, on 24th May 1969, at Ben Het Camp near the Cambodian border. His 212th Company of the 1st Mobile Strike Force Battalion was attacked by somewhere between 1,200 and 3,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars. His company was isolated, surrounded on 3 sides. His South Vietnamese and Montagnard troops began to fall back. Shrapnel from a grenade burst struck Payne, lodging in his skull, his arms, his hands. Under heavy fire, and with those wounds, Payne covered the withdrawal and organized his troops into a defensive perimeter. He then spent 3 hours, wounded, in enemy-dominated terrain, frequently under fire, searching the battlefield, for isolated and wounded soldiers. He found approximately 40 men. He brought some in himself. He organized the rescue of the others. He led the entire party back to base through terrain that the North Vietnamese Army considered its own. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star by the United States. The Republic of Vietnam added the Cross of Gallantry with Bronze Star, and Queen Elizabeth II presented him with the Victoria Cross aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia at Brisbane on the 13th of April, 1970. These were not men who needed to demonstrate their value. Their value was documented, decorated, and displayed on a chest that told the whole story to anyone who could read insignia. And the reality of a Saigon street, or a Saigon bar, or a Saigon traffic checkpoint in 1969 was that an American provost sergeant encountering Warrant Officer Simpson or Warrant Officer Payne in non-regulation headgear was not encountering a soldier out of compliance. He was encountering the most decorated Australian soldier alive, and he did not know it because he had no framework for understanding what an AATV warrant officer was, what an Australian VC looked like, or why the beret on that man's head was worth more institutional fights than any dress regulation was worth winning. The specific architecture of these confrontations followed a pattern that was documented not in any single report, but across the aggregate record of Australian-American relations in Vietnam. MACV maintained a comprehensive set of dress and conduct regulations that applied to Allied personnel operating within its administrative jurisdiction, which, practically speaking, meant any Allied soldier moving through a MACV-controlled area, which in practice meant Saigon and its immediate environs, the major bases, the logistical hubs, the transit corridors that connected remote operational areas to the capital. The regulations existed for coherent reasons. You needed to be able to identify friend from enemy. You needed to maintain the appearance of a coherent Allied force rather than a multinational jumble that the press could use to suggest Allied coordination was fragmenting. You needed, in the administrative language of a large military command, to enforce standards. The problem was that MACV's administrative jurisdiction was not the same thing as MACV's operational jurisdiction over Australian forces. The Australian Task Force answered to Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam in Saigon for national command, and to U.S. 2nd Field Force Vietnam at Long Binh for operational coordination. But coordination was not command. MACV could advise Australians. It could not order them. The AATV occupied an even more complex position. Its members were embedded with American Special Forces units, which meant they operated under American operational guidance in the field, but remained Australian soldiers for all national purposes. When an AATV warrant officer came into Saigon between operational rotations, he was subject to Australian military authority, not American military authority. An American provost sergeant stopping him in the street was asserting a jurisdiction that did not exist. Most of the time, this distinction did not matter. Most American military police were not stopping most Australian soldiers in most situations. The friction arose at specific pressure points: transit areas, R&R processing centers, Saigon streets where uniformed personnel were visible to the local population, and where MACV's appearance management instincts kicked in most strongly. And when a provost sergeant stopped an AATV warrant officer and demanded that a non-regulation beret be removed, what happened next depended entirely on who that warrant officer was. If he was junior, inexperienced, or simply uninterested in a fight, he might comply. He might remove the beret, pocket it, and put it back on the moment the provost was out of sight. If he was senior, experienced, and had been fighting in one jungle or another since before the provost sergeant had started secondary school, if he had 3 tours of Vietnam behind him and a chest full of decorations that included the VC or the DCM or both, he responded differently. He produced his identification. He explained, with the patient clarity of a man who has no time for institutional confusion, that he was a member of the Australian Army training team, that he was subject to Australian military authority, that the headgear he was wearing had been authorized by the Commander Australian Forces Vietnam, and that the sergeant might want to consider carefully whether he wanted this conversation to continue. The sergeant, in most documented cases, did not want the conversation to continue. The matter would occasionally escalate further, through Australian liaison officers, through the chain connecting MACV to Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam, through written communications that used diplomatic language to say what the sergeant on the street had encountered directly. These soldiers are not yours to correct. At one level, this is a story about a hat, a specific piece of fabric in a specific color worn by a specific group of men in a specific country during a specific war. The immediate stakes of any individual confrontation between an Australian warrant officer and an American provost sergeant were approximately 0. Nobody died. No operation was compromised. No strategic outcome turned on whether a green beret or a khaki bush hat sat on a particular head during a particular walk through the streets of Saigon. But military symbols are never only symbols. They are the compressed language of an institution, the shorthand through which armies communicate identity, authority, allegiance, and belonging. And the confrontations over the AATV's uniform were not really about headgear. They were about a question that ran through every level of Australian-American relations in Vietnam. Whose authority governed Australian soldiers, and what did it mean to wear a different flag in someone else's war? The Americans had an instinctive assumption, understandable given that they were providing the logistical base, the fire support, the helicopter assets, and the bulk of the casualties, that Allied forces operating within their administrative area operated within their institutional culture, that MACV dress standards, MACV operational doctrine, and MACV metrics of success applied to all forces fighting alongside them, not just American forces. The assumption was not malicious. It was the natural disposition of a dominant partner. When you are the largest force in a coalition by a factor of 60, you tend to set the standards. The Australians rejected this assumption not as an act of hostility, but as a product of experience. The experience of Singapore in 1942, where 15,000 Australians had marched into captivity because British command had applied European doctrine in an Asian jungle environment. The experience of the Malayan emergency, where the patient, small unit, intelligence-driven methods that Australia had developed through hard practice had worked when massive sweeps had not. The experience of the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo, where Australian and British special forces had operated in conditions that made Vietnam look administratively straightforward. Every confrontation over a beret was a small reenactment of the larger argument. We are not your subordinates, we are your allies, and the distinction matters. For a man like Ray Simpson, the uniform he wore was not decoration. It was autobiography. The rifle green AATV beret, or the green beret he wore during his years embedded with American Special Forces, sat on the head of a man who had been fighting since 1944, who had enlisted the same year as the Cowra breakout, when Japanese prisoners of war burst from their compound in the New South Wales countryside, and 231 of them died in the subsequent pursuit, who had served in Korea, in Malaya, on 3 separate tours of Vietnam, who had left the Australian Army in 1966, not because he was tired of fighting, but because the Australian bureaucracy was not prepared to send him back to Vietnam for a 3rd time. And so he had gone to Saigon by himself and re-enlisted there because he understood that his skills were needed and he was not finished. He had been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions in September 1964, when he was severely wounded in the leg by an ambush and then held off the enemy through repeated assaults until help arrived, weak from blood loss, directing his radio with his remaining strength. He had commanded indigenous troops in the Central Highlands who trusted him not because he was their officer in any formal sense, but because he had demonstrated repeatedly and at close personal cost that he would not leave them. He had received the Silver Star and the Bronze Star from the United States for actions that American commanders had witnessed firsthand and had assessed, in their own language, as exceeding the standard they required of their own soldiers. And on August 28, 1969, the Commonwealth of Australia Gazette announced that Warrant Officer Class 2, Rayeen Stewart Simpson, had been awarded the Victoria Cross. A provost sergeant stopping him in Saigon was not stopping a soldier in a non-regulation hat. He was stopping the living embodiment of everything the AATV stood for, and demanding that he conform to a standard set by an institution that had been, for years, politely and persistently asking Australia to fight its way instead of its own, and receiving politely and persistently the same answer: no. The AATV's motto was persevere. It was stitched across the bottom of the shield on their shoulder patch, and it was chosen with the deliberate understatement that characterizes Australian military culture at its best. Persevere. Not triumph, not dominate, not overwhelm. Persevere. In the context of what AATV members actually did, the word takes on dimensions that its 6 letters do not initially suggest. Persevering for Kevin Wheatley meant refusing to leave a dying man in a rice paddy under machine gun fire until the enemy reached him. Persevering for Peter Badco meant leading South Vietnamese soldiers into 3 separate engagements in 6 weeks that his superior officers would have told him, had they known in advance, were not survivable for the officer at the front. The 3rd one wasn't. Persevering for Ray Simpson meant walking into Saigon in 1967 after discharging himself from the Army and re-enlisting on the spot because there was still work to do, and he knew how to do it, and no administrative process was going to persuade him otherwise. Persevering for Keith Payne meant 3 hours alone in the dark in enemy-dominated terrain with shrapnel in his skull, searching for men who needed to be brought home. And persevering for the AATV as an institution meant maintaining Australian identity, Australian standards, and Australian authority over Australian soldiers in the face of constant pressure from an ally that was 60 times larger, incomparably better resourced, and fundamentally convinced, as large institutions tend to be, that its way was the right way. The Beret confrontations were one front in this larger perseverance. Small ones, individually trivial, collectively significant, because they documented, in street-level detail, exactly what Australian operational independence looked like when it met American institutional authority on the most mundane possible terrain. The Australian position every time was the same. We are here, we are fighting, We are decorated. We answer to our own chain of command, and your dress regulations do not apply to us. There is a cost to becoming the kind of soldier these men became, and it is not measured in the confrontations they won or the decorations they carried. It is measured in what they brought home. The AATV's post-service record carries a shadow that the combat record does not. Australian Vietnam veterans overall suffered post-traumatic stress at rates that eventually exceeded their American counterparts. A counterintuitive finding, given that the Americans sustained far greater overall casualties, but one that makes sense when you understand how Australians fought. The AATV operated in conditions of constant isolation, long-duration exposure to extreme threat, and high individual responsibility. There was no large unit around you absorbing the psychological weight. There was no safe rear area where you could decompress. There was no rotation policy that pulled you out of the operational environment at predictable intervals and gave you structured recovery time. There was just the mission and the man beside you and the next operation and the one after that. Ray Simpson served 3 tours in Vietnam spread across a decade. Keith Payne went to Vietnam in February 1969 and was evacuated wounded in September of the same year. His tour condensed into 7 months that contained more concentrated violence than most men encounter across a lifetime of service. Both men carried the weight of what they had seen and done long after the war was over, navigating a civilian world that had no framework for understanding what an AATV warrant officer's experience looked like from the inside. What the Beret represented in this light was not just unit pride or national identity or institutional stubbornness, it was continuity, a thread connecting the man in the Saigon street back to the man in the Kontum jungle, to the man in the Malayan rubber, to the 18-year-old who had changed into his uniform on a commercial aeroplane because diplomatic sensitivity required it. Remove the beret, and you remove one of the visible markers of everything that experience had made him. Ask him to conform to someone else's standard, and you are asking him to pretend that his own standard does not exist. He had earned his standard. He had paid for it in blood and isolation and years of jungle that no one outside the wire would ever fully understand, and he would not take it off. The AATV served for 10 years, 4 months, and 16 days, the longest continuous deployment of any unit from any service in any theater of the entire Vietnam War. Its 33 killed and 122 wounded were a small fraction of the total Allied casualty list. Its 4 Victoria Crosses represented a concentration of acknowledged valor that no comparable formation from any nation had matched. In 2002, the AATV badge and an Australian flag were incorporated into a memorial unveiled in North Carolina at Fort Bragg, the home of U.S. Army Special Forces dedicated to American Special Forces who served in Vietnam. The AATV was one of the first groups of foreign soldiers ever to be honored on a United States war memorial. The citation for the memorial acknowledged what individual provost sergeants and some MACV colonels had been slow to recognize, that these were not auxiliary troops who happened to be attached to American operations. These were Allied professionals who had often outdone their American counterparts in the field and who had consistently, across a decade of conflict, demonstrated that there was more than one way to fight a counterinsurgency, and that the Australian way worked. Keith Payne, as of 2026, is still alive. He is 92 years old, living in Mackay, Queensland. He is the last living recipient of the original Imperial Victoria Cross, the last surviving link to a system of recognition for gallantry that goes back to the Crimean War in 1856. He has spent his post-service decades working with veterans, particularly those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, applying to that work the same methodical care he applied to finding 40 wounded men on a dark hillside in the Central Highlands in May 1969. Ray Simpson died of cancer in Tokyo on the 18th of October 1978. He had spent his final years working as an administrative officer at the Australian Embassy in Japan, in the country where he had married his wife Shoko in 1953, when the White Australia policy was still in effect, and the marriage of an Australian soldier to a Japanese woman required a particular kind of determination to navigate. He is buried at the Yokohama War Cemetery. His Victoria Cross is displayed in the Hall of Valor at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. His portrait is also displayed at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg in the Hall of Heroes, the recognition given to foreign soldiers who had demonstrated excellence alongside American Special Operations Forces. It hangs there with Ray Simpson's citation, among a hall of men who understood that the measure of a soldier is not found in dress regulations. The uniform confrontations of Vietnam, the beret disputes, the dress code arguments, the small institutional frictions that played out in Saigon streets and transit areas and provost offices, were never going to be resolved by any individual argument. They were the surface symptom of a structural disagreement that went all the way up to the political level. What does Allied partnership actually mean when one partner is 60 times the size of the other? The American answer, at the institutional level, was that Allied partnership meant operating within American command structures, adopting American doctrine, reporting in American metrics, and appearing, wherever possible, as a coherent part of an American-led effort. The Australian answer, consistent from 1962 to 1972, was that Allied partnership meant fighting alongside Americans, sharing intelligence with Americans, coordinating operations with Americans, and saving American lives when American operations went wrong, while remaining, in every fundamental respect, Australian. The AATV's beret was a small flag planted in Saigon streets on behalf of that answer. The provost sergeant, who told an Australian warrant officer that the beret had to come off, was not a villain in this story. He was a soldier doing his job within the institutional framework he had been given. The warrant officer who declined to remove it was also a soldier doing his job, the job of being Australian in an American war on Australian terms, with Australian authority, carrying Australian decorations that no American dress regulation had been designed to accommodate. One of those decorations was a bronze cross, 8-pointed, suspended from a crimson ribbon. The warrant officer who wore it had earned it by standing alone between wounded men and enemy fire, and refusing to move until every one of those men was safely away. A provost sergeant asking him to remove his hat was not, in any meaningful sense of the word, a challenge. The hat stayed on. The question of what it meant, what it represented, what it cost to earn the right to wear it, and what it said about the people who wore it. That question outlasts the war, outlasts most of the men who fought it, and outlasts every dress regulation that was ever written to contain them. Persevere.